So in this video, we will be picking up where we left off in Stalking Jack the Ripper by Carrie Maniscalco on chapter 20. I hope everybody is having a wonderful holiday season, that you're enjoying your month of December as much as I am. I can't say it enough. It is my favorite holiday. It's my favorite month. I just love everything about it. I love my shirt. Got some Kiri Baku action going on, which is awesome, from My Hero Academia. Love it. Anyway, without further ado, reading by Ree, we'll pick up now on chapter 20. There is a picture of Mitri Square, 1925. It's a picture. Hopefully you can see it. Okay, moving on. Chapter 20. Double event. Mitri Square, London, 30 September 1888. A crowd of angry men and women surged against a barricade made up of police bodies, fear driving their emotions into boiling rage. I pulled my shawl closer, covering my face from both the early morning chill and from people standing near. I did not wish to be recognized. My family had had enough to deal with as it was. Father had finally come home last night after almost a month away from his precious Llandinum, and I didn't want anyone informing him I'd sneaked out of the house and run here as quickly as I could. Testing his paranoia was something I hoped to avoid at least until Uncle was freed. Not to mention, I didn't want him rushing to marry me off if I proved too difficult for him to handle. He'd probably already picked a nice, suitable young man who lived far away from the city streets of London. I hated the idea of being trapped away in some gilded cage in the country, but I couldn't fault my father for trying to protect me, misguided as his attempts were. I raised my attention to the surrounding buildings. Tall brick monsters that were cold and unmoving. The enormous letters naming the Curly and Tongue building silently watched the chaos going on below, and I watched the building. If only those letters could speak of the secrets they witnessed last night. I tried absorbing every detail I could, the same way Thomas or Uncle would do, were they here. I hadn't spoken to Thomas in 2 days, the sting of his accusations still very much in the forefront of my mind. Mitri Square was the perfect place for a killing. Buildings formed a massive courtyard, keeping prying eyes from main thoroughfares away. From rumors sweeping from the crowd, it was an even better place for a double murder. Jack the Ripper came back with a vengeance for nearly a month of peace. After nearly a month of peace, he had made idle threats in the Dear Boss letter. Jack had promised violence untold, and that's precisely what he'd done. A few men near the front of the crowd shouted for blood, igniting people around them into a blazing fury. A woman beside me shouted, "It ain't right! We need to catch him and kill him! Let the madman hang!" I turned my attention back to the living barricade. Through their limbs I barely made out a body covered in an off-white shroud, blood pooling around like a red lake near her head. Another body had been discovered a little ways down. It was the worst thing I could think, but there was no way Scotland Yard could execute Uncle now, not after another 2 bodies were so prominently displayed for all of London to look upon. There was a darkness growing inside me that needed to be rooted out. It was the second time that week I was mildly grateful for the Ripper. My own emotions sickened me. How dare I rejoice in someone else's misery? That made me no better than the murderer himself. Still, I was hopeful this crime would at least save one life, even if that hope made me a miserable thing. I felt a strong tap on my shoulder and spun around, my skirts twisting around my body. Superintendent Blackburn shook his head, his fair hair catching the light of the sun. "I'd inquire about the weather, but I'm sure you'd like to speak of other things, Miss Wadsworth." He squinted toward the body, shielding his eyes with his hand. "Seems our boy gave us 2 more victims." I followed his gaze, nodding. There wasn't much to add to that, so I stayed silent, watching and listening to people closest us while they speculated on the vicious leather-aproned lady-killer, though I'd hardly refer to Jack as our boy. There was an essence of unease slowly moving through my body that had nothing to do with the deceased woman or frightened crowd. I felt Blackburn carefully studying me, but kept my attention elsewhere. Something about his manner made me feel as if I were being investigated for a crime I had no recollection of committing. "Since I know it'll do no good asking you to speak with me later," Blackburn continued, "I might as well invite you to inspect the scene now. Your uncle obviously cannot be here, and there's no one else I'd trust with giving a proper assessment, unless, of course, you don't feel you can handle it." Not quite wrapping my brain around the invitation, I blinked at him. I was merely an apprentice studying under Uncle, but Blackburn seemed eager for my opinion on the matter, and I was willing to set aside doubts regarding him for a chance to examine the bodies. I swallowed, casting my attention around. No one was paying us any mind. Of course I'll inspect them. Blackburn focused on me, a hint of uncertainty twitching across his lips. "You may want to prepare yourself regardless. Seeing a body on a mortuary table and seeing a body lying in a bloody pool in an alley are a bit different." If he was trying to intimidate me, it wasn't working. Little did he know I'd already come across a body in an alley and lived to tell the gruesome tale. I was more than eager to get a closer look at the scenes, to understand the mind of a man who was brutalizing these women. I imagined it would be one of the most horrific things I'd ever see, but I wouldn't let fear hold me prisoner. Darkness within me rejoiced for the opportunity of seeing the bodies up close, in the state the murderer had intended them to be discovered. Perhaps I'd find a useful clue. When I lifted my chin, allowing defiance to wash over my features, Blackburn chuckled. "You're a lot like me." He smiled, pleased with my reaction. "Stay close and don't speak. I may be keen on having your opinion, but not all men will have the same feelings on the matter. Best you let me do the talking." "Very well." While it wasn't something I relished, it was the hard truth. I was a young girl growing up in a world run by old men. I'd pick and choose my battles wisely. Without uttering another word, we pushed our way to the front of the crowd and stood before the line of constables. Women slowly moved away from Blackburn, their eyes taking in his form appreciatively as he passed. A burly man with a ginger beard and matching bushy eyebrows halted our movement. "No one's to pass by. Orders of the commissioner." Blackburn stood straighter, nodding as if he'd heard this before, then simply said, "I am well aware of that order, as I was the one who instructed the commissioner to issue it. Thank you for upholding the command so dutifully." He leaned in, reading the man's name tag. "Constable O'Brien. I've brought a private assistant, proficient in forensic sciences. I'd like her thoughts before we move the bodies." The constable eyed me with distaste. I buried my hands in my skirts, gripping the material until I was positive I'd rip it off. Oh, how I despised remaining silent under such awful judgment. I'd like to remind each man who held such poor opinions of a woman that their beloved mothers were in fact women. I didn't see any men running about, birthing the world's population, then going on to make supper and tend to the house. Most of them buckled their knees when the slightest sniffle attacked them. There was more strength held underneath my muslin layers and well-perfumed skin than in half the men in London combined. I forced my mind to stay focused on our task, lest my emotions show plainly on my face. After an uncomfortably long pause, Blackburn cleared his throat. The constable shifted his attention back to his superior, color creeping up his collar. "Right. Sorry, sir. We weren't told you'd be coming in. And isn't it wonderful I'm informing you directly of my newest plans?" Blackburn interrupted, clearly put off by the delay. I wondered fleetingly if this was something he put up with often, given his young age. "Unless you'd like to answer to me later, I suggest you allow us passage," he said. "I'm growing rather annoyed, Constable. Each precious moment wasted here is another moment my scientist loses accuracy." With that, the man stepped aside. All thoughts of how aggravating he was disappeared when I saw the pale foot sticking out from beneath the nearest shroud. I wish I'd been disgusted by the sight. Instead, I found myself grossly fascinated, longing to lift the sheet and take a closer look. Blackburn motioned to the men standing guard around the body, and they promptly scattered themselves. Blackburn leaned close. "Take your time. I'll make sure no one disturbs you." I nodded, then knelt beside the body, carefully avoiding the pool of blood near the shoulders, and gently pulled the sheet back. I held my gasp in, squeezed my eyes shut, and prayed I wouldn't drop the covering like a squeamish little child. Perhaps I wasn't as ready for this as I'd imagined. I kept my eyes closed, breathing through my mouth until the dizziness eased up. It wouldn't do to faint in front of most of the police force in London, especially when they already thought me handicapped by my gender. Gathering my wits, I forced myself to examine the body. The woman was slight, probably about 5 feet tall. Her face was badly damaged. Blood and cuts disfigured her mouth and nose. She was lying on her back, right knee bent and facing outward, her left leg lying flat, not entirely unlike how Miss Annie Chapman had been found. A small blue tattoo was on her forearm. Bolts and gears, smeared in blood, peeked out from beneath her body. I'd no idea why Jack needed such things. Continuing with my inspection, I focused on what I could figure out. Her entire torso was sliced open down the middle with surgical precision, her intestines thrown over her shoulders. A portion of them even appeared to be cut and draped between her left arm and body purposely, a message of sorts. I swallowed my emotions down. I needed to get through this examination. I needed to understand the mind of this madman, understand what drove him to such violence, so he could never do this to another woman again. I took a deep breath, my focus trailing over the corpse once more, though my heart refused to be tamed. Like the others, her throat had been slashed. Unlike the others, however, a slice ran down her right ear. It seemed he tried cutting a piece off. A memory nearly knocked me backward. I called to Blackburn, my voice rising with excitement. "The letter," I said, thoughts racing along with my pulse as he drew near. "The author of that letter is the killer. He said he'd clip her ear. Look." I pointed out the disfigurement on her person. He did exactly as he promised. "The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly, wouldn't you?" Blackburn's attention drifted over the body, then quickly moved away. "Even if the letter is proven authentic, we've no way of tracing its origin." I sat back on my heels, contemplating scenarios. I thought about the editor of the newspaper, and an idea jumped up, waving its arms in my face. Well, what if you had Dr. Doyle print a facsimile of the letter? Surely someone might recognize the handwriting. Plus, he said he'd run it if it proved true. Superintendent Blackburn tapped his fingers against his trousers, staring into my eyes so deeply I believed he was trying to send a secret message. I wasn't sure why he was hesitating. It was the perfect solution. After a minute, he reluctantly nodded. "It's a fine idea, Miss Wadsworth." Blackburn smiled, a dimple appearing in his cheek. He pointed toward the body, setting my focus on the horror once again. "What else have you got from all this, then?" "Well," I stared at the blood spatter, knowing it told a story of its own. Losing myself completely in the science, the blood on the left side of the neck appeared to have been spilled first, as it was clotting differently from blood located on the right side of the body. It wasn't hard to deduce. Her throat had been slashed first before she was split open. I crept closer, pointing out each injury for Blackburn. He started with her throat, then probably cut or struck her mouth. I doubt he appreciated what she'd had to say and wanted to punish her. I moved on to the next injury. Once she was choking on blood, he laid her body out, placing her legs straight out before running his blade over her abdomen. He removes the intestines, probably for easy access to her organs. See, this cavity is too hollow. It's how a body looks after Uncle removes organs during post-mortems. I can't tell without getting my hands in there which ones are missing, but I think it's probably her uterus or ovaries, possibly even a kidney or gallbladder as well. What do you think? I looked up when Blackburn didn't respond, seeing signs of sickness sprawled across his handsome features. I pressed my lips shut. What a monster I must seem to him. Aunt Amelia would drag me to church and say 1,000 prayers if she were here. I watched the column of his throat move in an attempt at swallowing. He tried maintaining his composure, but gagged when a fly landed on her exposed cavity. I shooed the offender away, watching it land near her bloodied face. They'd need to remove her from the scene before flies began laying larvae. Blackburn coughed, drawing my attention back to him. I stood quickly, offering him a handkerchief, but he shook his head, holding a fist to his mouth. "I'm quite all right, thank you. Possibly something I ate didn't agree with me. Sure, it's nothing to be concerned over." A small part of me wanted to smile. Here was a young man one who'd surely seen his share of horror working in this line of business, and here I was, a small, slender girl offering to be his strength. "I'll make a few notes, if you wouldn't mind," I said. "Then I'll share them with my uncle. He will be released now, won't he?" Blackburn shifted from left to right, watching as I removed a small journal from a pocket within my skirts and wrote notes in my best cursive. I didn't want to appear overly eager or hopeful, but needed to know Uncle would be all right, that he'd be safe and working alongside me before long. It felt as if a year had passed before Blackburn finally answered me. I can't see him going to trial after this. Unofficially, I'd wager he'll be out before the night's through. He paused. Perhaps you'd like to join me for some refreshments, after we look upon the next body, that is. I glanced up sharply. Was he really asking to see me under these circumstances? How odd. My thoughts must have shown plainly on my face because he fumbled for an explanation. I mean, perhaps we could have some tea and discuss the particulars of the victims. I'm sure that won't be necessary, William, someone said in a familiar, angry tone. Every single muscle of my body froze. Even my heart slowed its beat before accelerating. Father. Lord Edmund Wadsworth was a sight 1,000 times more frightening than the body lying at my feet. His expression held more warning than a knife placed against my jugular. When I agreed to let you court my daughter, I'd no idea you'd think it a proper thing involving her in such vile and masculine matters. I need someone reining her will in and protecting her, not feeding her dangerous curiosity. Shock punched at me from multiple angles. So many questions begged to be asked. How did he find me here? How did he know I'd left the house? But the most pressing one fell from my mouth first. What do you mean, allowed him to court? Before I finished my thought, I turned on Blackburn, confusion giving way to pure anger. You're the one who's been asking Father about a courtship? Meeting in secret? Plotting? Then another thought occurred to me, so obvious I almost laughed. That's why you want to help Uncle. Not because you think he's innocent, but because you're devious. Audrey rose, please. He started, holding his hand up. I never meant... Am I wrong? I demanded. Blackburn pressed his lips together, shooting a questioning look at my father. It was clear he wouldn't respond without approval, which was never likely to happen now. I fisted my hands. There was nothing I despised more than finding out I'd missed clues all along. What other secrets were being kept from me? My anger quickly faded when Father motioned for Blackburn's silence. He pointed his finger at me, bending it in a come-here-straight-away motion. If he ever let me out of the house again, it would be a miracle sent directly from heaven. How dare Blackburn keep such secrets from me? I cast another furious glare at him before obediently moving to Father's side. Then, when I thought the surprises were over, my brother skulked over, purposefully ignoring the body lying a few feet away from his polished shoes. He didn't meet my eyes as he made his way to Father's other side. Clearly, he turned me in to this overprotective madman. Filthy traitor. Of course the police barricade wouldn't apply to either of my family members. I wondered who they paid for their right to shun the laws or commands of the police. Now then, let's be gone from this abysmal scene and get you home where you'll be safe. Taking my arm, Father offered me a look only slightly less frightening now that I was under his control. We've much to discuss this evening, Audrey Rose. You cannot involve yourself with such dangers. I hate to do it, but this cannot go unpunished. Consequences come with a high cost, some more than others. Chapter 21. The Wretched Truth. Wadsworth Residence, Belgrave Square, 30 September 1888. The carriage ride home was almost as terrible as bearing witness to one of the mutilated bodies at the double event. I'd rather be on intestine cleanup duty than suffer through the choking silence sitting miserably with us. By the time we pulled up to our home, I was ready to burst out of my skin simply to escape the anger seeping through my pores. I was furious with Blackburn for conspiring with my father and not having the decency to mention it, but I was seething over my brother for most of all. How dare he betray me by leading our father to where I was? He had to know how mad it'd make Father, thinking his only daughter was in direct danger. The East End was rife not only with improper people, but with disease, which spread quickly because of the deplorable living conditions. What's more, it was foolish to drag Father to an area known for its opium dens. Every male in my life felt it necessary to put chains on me, and I despised it. Except for Thomas, I realized. He taunted me into acting and thinking for myself. Before I could race up to my room, Father called out to me, "A word, please, Audrey Rose." I closed my eyes briefly before turning around. I didn't want to be scolded or hear about how fragile life was or how foolish it was to place oneself in reckless situations, but saw no way out of it. When Father had something to say, one listened, and that was that. I drifted away from the stairway and the freedom it provided, heading directly toward the din of lecturing. Aunt Amelia and Liza were out shopping for fabrics to take back to the country with them. Their visit was nearly over, and they'd be leaving first thing in the morning. I was grateful they weren't here to witness my scolding. Aunt Amelia would say the last couple of weeks had done nothing to save either my soul or reputation. She might even suggest a little country air was exactly what I needed. Leaning against the wall in the corridor, Nathaniel still wouldn't meet my glare, enraging me all the more. What a slithering wimp. Father motioned for me to step into the drawing room and have a seat. With no other choice, I did. I settled into a chair as far away from him as possible, while waiting for my guilty verdict to be delivered and my punishment to be swiftly bestowed. Father was taking his time, however, calling for a tray of tea and biscuits, sorting through mail near the fireplace. If he was trying to ratchet up my anxiety, it was working. My heart thudded wildly against my ribs, begging to be set free with each new letter he tore into. The only sounds in the room came from the crackling fire and rustling of paper on paper. I sincerely doubted my sloshing blood could be heard, but it was a sinister symphony in my own ears nonetheless. I watched the careful way he held the letter opener, the sharp blade piercing the envelope, before he ripped the letters free with one savage swipe from another. Whenever I scared him, he turned into some foreign person, one who was both frightening and frightened at once. Folding my hands together in my lap, I waited as patiently as I could for him to calm himself enough to speak with me. My dark skirts were an abyss I'd like to sink into. He sealed an envelope, then handed it off to a servant before finally crossing the room. I understand you've been sneaking out of the house for some time now, studying forensic sciences with your uncle, is that right? Without asking, he poured a cup of tea, then offered it to me. I shook my head, too nervous to even dream of eating or drinking when he was so calm and composed. He paused, waiting for an excuse, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Once an animal's fate had been decided, there was no undoing the crimson necklace they'd wear. It mattered not what I said in my defense. He knew it as plainly as I did. He sat down, crossing one foot over his knee. What, pray tell, did you expect me to do upon finding out? Be pleased? Be supportive of you potentially throwing your life away? A flicker of rage showed in his chiseled features. He clenched his jaw, then exhaled slowly. I cannot allow you to tarnish your reputation by indulging your eccentricities and the debauchery you're involved with. Pleasant people who abide by polite society do not find themselves in your uncle's laboratory. Were your mother still alive, it would kill her to see you involved in such matters. I picked at the tiny buttons on the side of my gloves, fighting tears with all my might. I was angry with Father for his words, but most of all hated that he might be correct. Perhaps Mother would despise the work I did. From childhood, she was instructed to stay away from dreadful things owing to her weakened heart. My unbecoming work might very well have broken it had the fever not done it so first. But what of her insistence that I could be both strong and beautiful? Surely Father had to be wrong. Nathaniel moved from the doorway to stand inside the room. I hadn't noticed him still lingering there, but from the stricken expression on his face, knew he'd heard every word. I wanted to muster up a decent scowl, but couldn't find the strength. My heart ached too much. From this point forward you shall live according to society's rules, Father continued, satisfied with my obeisance. You'll smile and be charming to every suitor I deem acceptable to court you. There'll be no more talk of science or of your degenerate uncle. He moved out of the chair and stood before me so swiftly I couldn't prevent myself from recoiling. Should I discover your disobedience once more, you shall be turned out on the streets. I'll not tolerate you sniffing around this disturbing case any longer. Have I made myself perfectly clear? I drew my brows together. I could not comprehend what had just happened. Father had been mad before, angry enough to keep me indoors for weeks on end, but he'd never threatened to toss me into the streets. It went against the very purpose he had for keeping me close all my life. Why bind me to our home, only to throw me from it? I blinked tears back and kept my attention locked onto the swirling design on the rug, then slowly nodded. I didn't trust my voice. I refused to sound weak on top of looking the part so well, and knew my voice would crack under the weight of emotion. Father must have been pleased because his shadow lifted from before me, then disappeared from the room altogether. I listened as his heavy footsteps faded down the hall. When his study door slammed shut, I allowed myself to exhale. A single tear snaked down my cheek, and I angrily swiped it away. I had held it together for this long. I would not break in front of Nathaniel. I would not. Instead of rushing to my side as I expected, Nathaniel stayed planted to his post near the door, craning his neck into the hall. It was hard to tell if he was looking to escape or convincing himself to stay. "What did Father promise you for your betrayal?" His back stiffened, but he didn't turn around. I stood, moving closer. "Must have been extraordinary, something you couldn't turn down, a new suit, an expensive horse." He shook his head, hands twitching at his sides. Any second, and he'd grab the comfort of his comb. Stress never looked good on him. I stalked closer, my tone antagonizing. I wanted him to feel my hurt. "A large estate, then?" The silver comb flashed in the flickering firelight as my brother ran it through his hair. I went to walk by when he whispered, "Wait." His tone gave me pause, my silk shoes straddling the threshold. He sounded no louder than a church mouse squeaking inside a grand cathedral. Moving back into the room, I waited. I'd allow him the courtesy of saying his piece, then be on my way. I plopped onto the chair, exhausted from the day's events, while Nathaniel checked the hallway before closing the door. He paced, as all Wadsworth men were prone to do, agitation or nervousness shrouding him. It was hard to tell which emotion was getting the better of him. Nathaniel crossed the room to the buffet, removing a crystal decanter and matching glass. He poured himself a healthy amount of amber liquid, drinking it down in a few gulps. That was very un-Nathaniel-like. I sat forward. "What is it?" My brother shook his head, still facing the decanter, and refilled his cup. "I can't begin figuring where to start." The utter loathing in his tone chilled me. I got the impression we were no longer talking about him telling Father I'd sneaked out of the house this morning. My anger dissipated. Was something else wrong with Father? I couldn't take another emotional upheaval. There was too much to sort through as it stood. "Most start around the beginning," I said, hoping to keep the fear from my voice and force levity into it. "Tell me what's been troubling you. Please, let me help." Nathaniel stared at the crystal glass in his hand. It seemed easier for him to speak to it rather than meet my worried gaze. "Then I'll speak quickly, in hopes of causing you less pain." He took a sip of liquid courage, then another. "Mother wasn't the last person operated on by our loving uncle." I was grateful he paused, allowing me time to absorb the enormity of his words. Everything else in the room stopped, including my heart. This was a subject we were banned from discussing by both uncle and father. He's been attempting to complete a successful transplant since he and Father were young men." My brother pinched the bridge of his nose. "Father, while dealing with his own demons, reacts in such a way because he knows Uncle keeps secrets from you." "Secrets? I know all about Uncle's former experiments," I said, sitting straighter in my chair. "His attempt at saving Mother's life is why I started studying under him in the first place." "Saving her, was he?" Nathaniel gave me a pitying look. "For the good of London, they should have kept him locked away. He's never stopped his experiments, Audrey Rose. He's only gotten better at hiding them." "That's not true." I shook my head. How my brother could think such a thing about Uncle was preposterous. I'd know about any experiments. "I promise you, it's true. I hoped you'd outgrow your desire to apprentice with him, and thought it unnecessary to divulge such delicate matters." Nathaniel took my hand, squeezing gently until I met his eyes. "Just as I do not wish to burden you with too much now, sister. If you need some time—" "Oh, I'm more than ready to learn the truth, the entire truth, no matter how horrid it may be. Do enlighten me further, and make it quick." He nodded. "Very well, then. The entire truth is this. Your friend, Thomas Cresswell, he—" Nathaniel sat back and took another sip from his drink. I wasn't sure if the pause in the story was for my benefit or his. My stomach tied itself in knots as I waited for the next horror. "Are you sure you're all right? You look a bit peaked." "Oh, are you sure you're all right? You look a bit peaked." Please, tell me the rest. All right then, he said, releasing a shaky breath. Thomas's father came to Uncle after Mother's death. His wife experienced severe abdominal pain around that time. He'd heard rumors of Uncle's research. Nathaniel swallowed. Thomas's mother passed away shortly after hours of gallbladder issues. Uncle tried saving her life, too. Wonderful. So you're saying Uncle killed Thomas's mother? Nathaniel reached for me, slowly shaking his head. No, not exactly. Thomas has been obsessed with searching for a true cure ever since. It's all he talks of when the Knights of Whitechapel meet. I can practically conduct the research myself. He's gone into that much detail. He hasn't mentioned anything to me about it at all. Chills stuck their nails into my back, repeatedly dragging themselves downward. That wasn't entirely true. Thomas had insisted I remove the gallbladder from the cadaver he'd gotten from the necropolis. A memory of the latest crime scene flashed through my mind. I was almost positive a gallbladder had been taken from one of the victims, too. I felt utterly sick to my stomach. Could I have been so blind or so wrong about Thomas? No. I wouldn't accuse him of sadistic murder simply because he was different from other people in our closed-minded society. He was purposefully cold and detached working a case, and it was brilliant and necessary, wasn't it? My head suddenly pounded because maybe I was making excuses for him, or perhaps they were excuses he'd deftly planted in my brain. He was certainly cunning enough to do such a thing. But would he? Too many emotions swirled through my head to keep track of. If Thomas experienced the kind of heartache that came with watching as a loved one passed on, then perhaps he might do anything, even murder, to discover answers he'd sought. Then again, didn't I suffer from a similar heartache when Mother died? I suppose it was a decent enough reason for Jack to steal organs, but was Thomas, the arrogantly charming boy I knew outside of the laboratory, truly capable of committing such atrocities in the name of science? I hardly thought he could become that cold and remote. Still, my head spun. The ladies at tea claimed he was odd enough to be the madman, but that was merely idle gossip. I clenched my fist at my sides. I refused to believe my instincts were so wrong about him, even if there was some strong evidence to the contrary. Which was the exact notion that got the Ripper's victims murdered. I dropped my head into my hands. Oh, Thomas, how do I sort this mess out, too? All right, that was the end of Chapter 21. We will pick up on Chapter 22 in the next video. All right, that's it for now. Reading by Ree. Until next time. Bye.